So this third section has to do with co-cultures. If you remember back to the beginning of this chapter, the question was asked, who are you? And it was asking you to look at different groups that you belonged to. So within a larger culture, within the culture of the United States, you would say, yes, I am an American. Oh, it's just starting to pour. So if you hear a buzzing in the background, that's the rain. So you are an American, but you are also a student. That's a co-culture. You are also, a member of the chess club. I have no idea what people do. So there's an important concept, and I don't know why they don't talk about it right off the bat. That's called intersectionality, and I wanted to read it to you. It's simplistic to think of people as members of a single category. Okay, so social scholars have developed the concept of intersectionality to describe the interplay of social categories, including gender, race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, and disability status. And so those are the main co-cultures that this textbook, then this chapter is going to look at. This section is what the word I was looking for. No single label can fully explain someone's identities, perceptions, and behaviors. Okay, so now let's look at some of these major co-cultures. And the first one that we look at, and boy, is this not timely, is the issue or the co-culture of race and ethnicity. Now, scholars will say race has very little use in explaining individual differences because neither, how do I want to say this? There are more, race doesn't have a basis in genetics, and actually neither does ethnicity. So anyways, I went to I Googled it, and National Geographic has a great article which I wanted to read to you. Race and ethnicity are two concepts related to human ancestry. Race is defined as a category of humankind that shares certain distinctive physical traits. The term ethnicities is more broadly defined as large groups of people classed according to common racial, national, tribal, religious, linguistic, or cultural origin or background. Okay, this next part is the interesting part. Race is usually associated with biology and linked with physical characteristics such as skin color or hair texture. Ethnicity is linked with cultural expression and identification. This is the real. However, both are social constructs used to categorize and characterize seemingly distinct population. So I think the important idea there is they are social constructs. Okay, but so there's a lot going on today about race, but what the interesting thing is people who will say, yes, I am black, run the gamut from probably being as light-skinned as I am to being very dark. So, well then what does black mean if it's not? That's such a broad. There's such a broad range there. So maybe black is less a race and it's more of an ethnicity. But okay, here's a little story about ethnicity. If ethnicity looks at the group that you identify with, my brother-in-law, born, raised in Maine, then moved to Connecticut when he was, middle school, and his family, all his relatives, French Canadian, and that is their identity. And a few years ago, he and my sister and their kids did I think it was 23andMe, the DNA testing. So this strongly French Canadian man found out that there's almost no French in him. He's mostly Italian. So I think that's why they say there's no genetic basis to this. But despite that, you can see how a person identifies is going to have an impact on how they communicate with people who are members of outgroups. I think part of it is the underlying message of you do not understand what I'm going through. Okay, so, and there's a lot. We can talk about this much more when we meet virtually. Okay, the next big one is gender identity and sexual orientation. And the idea with this, I mean, the question is, how does this affect somebody's communication? Well, obviously, so many people being afraid to be up. I think it's much less common now than it was when I was growing up, for sure. People being afraid to communicate who they were. Like it says, disclosure can be risky. I would say the social climate has become more receptive, and they talk about I forget what it's called. There's on the wrong page there. It Gets Better project has a spot for people to share their stories. And so again, when you identify as part of a co-culture, it's a lot easier to talk to people who also belong to that co-culture. You're in group. It's harder to, I'm not saying impossible, but it's harder to talk to people who are part of that out group. Then the next one has to do with age and generation, and that age-related communication reflects culture as much as biology. Definitely in the West, in the US, we honor youth. You know, people spend a lot of money getting facelifts, and people dye their hair. Okay, so my hair is purple. And I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and I was saying, I'm not dyeing it to cover gray. I'm dyeing it because I like the color purple. But truthfully, there is some gray in my hair, and gray hair means old person who's definitely not with it. And that's not the image that I want to portray. But that's my fear, is that's what people see in a culture that honors youth. So in a culture that honors youth, we would tend to believe that someone who is older is not going to communicate well. Maybe they don't hear very well, or they don't understand all the slang that people use. I don't know if there's an equivalent for men, but for women, when people don't know what to call you, it's not uncommon, if you are a young woman, to be referred to as Miss. And at a certain point, you are no longer perceived as Miss, you become ma'am. And I have to tell you, it doesn't feel good the first time that happens. And then what I've noticed was a couple of years ago, I was at the grocery store, and instead of saying, you know, do you have any coupons, ma'am? The woman said, do you have any coupons, dear? So that's to me, that's patronizing speech. Or sometimes people talk like this when they're talking to someone older. So they would use words like dear and an exaggerated tone of voice, almost like you're talking to a child. And sometimes I would assume the reverse happens, that older people talk to younger people as if they're idiots and don't understand. So I was wondering if any of you work in multi-generational workplaces. Do you work with people who are considerably older or younger than you, who belong to a different generation? And what kind of communication challenges might happen because of this? So I like the line in the book, when members of co-cultures have different expectations, miscommunication can occur. They gave the example of millennials needing approval. Once they do a job, they need to have someone say, you did a great job. And people who are maybe boomers you don't congratulate someone because they did a job they were supposed to do. So this can cause issues. I did a lot of work, and I didn't get any, my boss didn't even acknowledge it. And the boss goes home and says to her family, can you believe it? That this young whippersnapper who did the job and expected me to praise them for doing something that they were supposed to do anyways. So Again, it's probably easier to talk to people of your same generation because they speak the same language. Okay, the next culture is, do you belong to the co-culture of able-bodied or disabled? And they say nearly 1 in 5 adults in the United States has a disability. So if you are someone with a disability, what is your choice? Do you assimilate into the organization? Let's think about this in the workplace. Do you do all you can to pretend that you don't have this disability because you just want to assimilate? Or do you look for accommodation? Do you say, I can do this job, but I can't stand, I need to sit. I can do this job, but I have to take breaks, or whatever it is. And neither one is bad or good. It's just different strategies that people use. And obviously the strategy they use is going to affect their communication. If you're choosing to assimilate, you're going to avoid the whole topic of disabilities completely. If you choose to go the route of accommodation, you're probably going to be a little bit more open to talking about that. So it's important to treat disability as one feature, not a defining characteristic. There's a great story that closes out this section about, and you don't want to be defined because you have brown eyes, right? Or you don't want to be defined one way because you're tall. So why should you be defined a certain way because you happen to be in a wheelchair, as the example in the book? Now, a couple of years ago, when I was teaching public speaking, and I had a student who was deaf, and I wasn't sure how I was supposed to judge her speaking when she wasn't the one speaking. Her interpreter was speaking for her. She was signing, and the interpreter was obviously interpreting. And so I reached out to my colleagues, and one of them said, "Oh, I've had students with disabilities over the years, and it's been such an honor to teach them." And I thought, why? I wouldn't say, "Oh, I've had some really short students over the years, and let me tell you, it's been an honor to teach them." I mean, as we say, it is one aspect, and it should not be the defining characteristic. But obviously, that is going to affect how people communicate, because I've got to imagine that my colleague who said that probably, I can almost, and I don't know, so I'm making this up, that she probably used that slightly patronizing tone of voice like people use with older people. "Oh, it's so good to have you in class. How are you doing?" I don't know. I'm probably maligning her character. But okay, let us go to the last co-culture, and that would be socioeconomic status. Now, this book talks about working class, middle class, upper class. If any of you have taken sociology or maybe even social problems, I mean, there's what, underclass and lower class and upper middle and all different classes. But to simplify, we're just using these three. And so then the idea becomes again that you are probably more comfortable communicating with people who are in the same socioeconomic status as you, because it might be true, or it might be an assumption that they share similar experiences and similar values with you. And I like the example that they gave, that college-educated, college professor has certain expectations of what it means to be a good student. And someone maybe from a working class background is not apt to say, "Professor Dowen, I don't really understand that. Could you explain it again?" Because that's maybe a little too challenging, and certainly would never say, "No, I disagree." So the idea of speaking up, of using some critical thinking, is not something that this student has grown up with. So they're not likely to use it in the classroom, and then that can cause some communication problems. What happens if you move from one class to the next? You start your life middle class and you've worked really hard and you work your way up to the middle class, and then you go back and you talk to your old friends from the old neighborhood. Do you do some code switching, right? We'll talk about this in chapter 5 when we talk about language. Do you talk the way you talked to them when you were hanging out with them, or do you talk the way that you do now? I have a colleague, Professor Hansen, and we're good friends, and he and I both teach first year experience, and we co-taught a segment. And I'm middle-aged, middle class, grew up in Plainville. I think I might have mentioned that already, and not sure where Alva grew up, but definitely more in the city. And he's black, and he's just he has a level of cool that I can never have, and he knows he's younger. He can make references that people don't, that people know that I don't. And so I just thought it must have been really, every once in a while he's Professor Hansen, and then he switches and he uses language that the students understand, and that I think if I tried to use that, it would come across as utterly ridiculous. And the same thing happens to people who are first-generation college students, because at home they don't understand the world of college. They don't speak college. So when you go back to your family, do you speak college? And the people say, well, who do you think you are? You forgot where you came from? Or, do you say, well, I learned this new way of communicating and it's not going to work here? All right. Bottom line, these are the 5 big areas, that 5 big aspects of co-culture. There are many more. Just the bottom line, what I would like you to take away from this is your co-cultures are going to influence how you communicate, because there are certain co-cultural values and norms that you will have that are shared by the other people in your co-culture. And that is the end of section 3.